Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson, and this week we are joined by one of the best horror writers at it right now. You will know him from books like The Bone Mother and The Butcher's Daughter. His landmark queer horror novel, Red X, originally published in 2021, is out now in a beautiful new edition from Hell's Hundred. David Demchuk, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It is so great to have you here. We have followed each other online for a while, and I've kind of been looking for a reason to get you on, and then I found out about this reissue of Red X and was like, perfect. Okay, we gotta talk to David about Red X. Which, congratulations on this reissue, by the way. It is a beautiful new printing of Red X. You have a foreword in here from Gretchen Felker Martin. You have some additional writing from Anthony Oliveira about some of the true story subject matter behind the latter parts of the book. I don't want to ask you to describe the whole plot of Red X, but for those who don't know, this is a book about queer people in Toronto's gay village over the course of decades being preyed on by something that may or may not be supernatural. Um, where does the book start for you? Like, what was the initial idea? Because I can see so many different ways in. What do you think was the initial, like, okay, this is a book now, I have to write this? I know it started as a play, right?
That's exactly correct. It started as a play, which I was writing around about 2016. So, in fact, even before I worked on The Bone Mother, I had been working on this play, and the impetus for the play was that I really wanted to do something around Toronto's queer village, Toronto's gay village, and how I felt that it had the potential to be a haunted place. For those of you who don't know Toronto, it is not one of the ancient cities of the world. It was colonized in the sort of late 1700s, early 1800s, and it's not a city that you would ever normally think of as being haunted. Most of the older buildings, most of the older terrain has been sort of transformed over the many decades, and it sort of prides itself on its newness, and it doesn't have a lot of texture the way that, say, Montreal does, or or Paris, or London. So it was, and yet I've always felt that it had a kind of a haunted or a gothic quality to it. One of the things that urged me to sort of move forward with it as an idea was that there had been some disappearances. About, I think at that point, three men had disappeared in a relatively short period of time. I would say over a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And it was not clear that whether these disappearances were connected in any way. It was also not unique. Um, I had certainly, growing up in the 60s, and 70s, I was certainly aware that there had been disappearances, primarily of gay men, in a number of large cities around the world, um, you know, over various decades, and there had been various explanations for it. Um, a serial killer, possibly multiple serial killers, possibly institutional killers, the police, for example, um, possibly people just running away from the city, changing their names, changing their lives, going back home. Any number of things that can happen, but suddenly, there's an absence in your community. And I thought it would be really interesting to explore that as a phenomenon in a kind of a supernatural context. The play originally was set in the theater that it would have been staged in Toronto's gay village, and ostensibly the theater would be presented as a haunted space, and so I was quite intrigued by all of that, and in fact, I heard stories about the theater that suggested perhaps it was a haunted space, so that made it even more interesting. And the play never actually happened, and that was okay. That's a thing that occurs. So I just basically trunked it, as one does, and then turned my attention to what ultimately became The Bone Mother. It too started as a play. Then I turned it into what ended up being my first novel. And it met with quite a bit of success. And the very first thing people said to me, as they do, was, well, do you have something else? Do you have a new book in the works? And of course, and like a loser, my answer was, well, no. But I thought to myself, well, I do have this play. I do have Red X, and I wonder if it could work as a book. And so I brought it out, and it, like most plays, there's a meta theatrical element to it the moment you put your ass in the chair, because you know that what you're looking at on stage is not real people, generally speaking, acting out real things in front of you. There are already layers of reality and unreality that are being presented. And one of the things that I most wanted to capture was that sort of like metatextual element, which is a thing that I'm now known for, and it's a thing I enjoy when I'm exploring this kind of stuff. And so I got to work thinking, okay, there could be a fictional narrative that is about, the supernatural creature that is hunting these men. And by the way, at this moment, as I was now working on it becoming a book, several more men have disappeared. And again, we were being told the same things. Oh, they're not related. Oh, no, don't be silly. There's no serial killer. Oh, we don't know what's really happened with them. Since a lot of them, in fact, I would say almost all of them were immigrants, there was the suggestion that they'd gone back to their home countries, they'd left for the United States or some other country. There was all of that kind of stuff sort of, in the air. And I just thought, okay, I'm going to continue in this vein. And for the metatextual element, I thought, well, I could do some essays, some nonfiction writing that would punctuate the book at various breaks. And the logical time to have breaks would be, say, between decades, or between, in this case, in the end, it was 8-year periods. And so that was the general direction I was going in, and that was the general inspiration that I had. And then I'm very sad to say a friend of mine disappeared, and he did not fit the profile of the other people who had disappeared. So we truly thought that he was not connected. We thought that there had been some kind of misadventure. And like, when it was happening, when I characterized it, I said, oh, he's the kind of person who, if he saw a dog, down in a ravine whose leash had been wrapped around a tree or something, he would stupidly go down there, if it had just rained or something, and he would like slide and fall, and he would like break his fucking neck. And so, which, I mean, it was just entirely what he was all about. And so there were search parties, including in the ravines, and trying to figure out where he'd been last seen. He was very well loved in the community. He was, I would say, without being in any way wealthy, he was, as far as social capital was concerned, he was, I would say, in a place of privilege in the community. He was the opposite of the others in that he was immediately noticed and immediately missed. And that's what led to the discovery that he had been murdered, and that he and the others had been murdered by this individual. And his remains were found in a particularly gruesome way, and as were some of the others. And then it turned into, I mean, I guess the nicest thing you could say about it is a shit show. It was a disaster. And at that point, my relationship to the book changed. I mean, my relationship to the world changed. A friend of mine had been murdered, but particularly with the book, I was just like, this had been like a series of lightning strikes that were coming closer and closer to me, and this one was right in front of my face. And so I turned to a friend of mine, who was a journalist, um, and which I guess shows how poorly I can choose these things. And I said to her, "Well, I can't keep writing this book. It's impossible now." And she was like, "What are you doing? Why not?" And I said, "Well, because it's it's no longer abstract. It's no longer theoretical. It's no long we can't pretend that this is a fictional thing. It's crystallized completely. And of course she would. She said, "Oh, you must do this. It's all the more reason for you to do it now. You must write it." And I was like, "Oh, God." And so I thought, and then I said to her, "Well, if I am going to write it, then I'm going to have to implicate myself." That's the exact word I used. I'm going to have to implicate myself. Why am I, as a queer person, drawn to horror? Why would I, as a queer writer, write about queer people being put into this situation? What is my thought process in this? What am I doing here? Um, what is the role of queer people in horror traditionally? And how, in my way, can I address that and perhaps subvert that? And 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 so that became part of the nonfictional aspect, which were the essays that punctuate the story. And it was the right thing to do to go ahead. I'm sure there are a lot of people who disagree, but for me, it was the right thing to do to go ahead and to try to figure out how to work with this material in an honest and responsible fashion, but not hold back and not hold back on myself, which was also extremely tough. I mean, I didn't want to flagellate myself in the book because that's a whole other kind of exploitation. It's a kind of self-exploitation. But I did want to really turn, I guess, a kind of a gimlet eye upon myself and go, what exactly are you doing here? And really, as horror writers, what are any of us doing here? And so that, in a very sort of long kind of, tale, um, describes how it is that I came to write the book.
The book holds together very well as a complete uh, piece of work, but there is a point I feel as a reader where the switch flips, where you feel like, okay, there is skin in the game for David, not just David the writer, but David the character, because you do take on this sort of metafictional, uh, not persona, but your essays, the idiom changes, as you move through them. And like you said, this was something very, very, very close to your life. Um, did writing the book in that way and getting that close to it and implicating yourself, as you said, was that how did that affect your own fears? Because you talk about your own fears through the book. Like, did you come out of this book feeling freer, or did you come out of this book being more afraid than you've ever been? Because I know as we horror people often have a lot of fears that we keep close.
I have a catalog of fears. I wouldn't be writing in horror if I couldn't, like, just sort of turn my head, 1 degree, one direction or the other and go, oh, there's a thing I can write about because that's a thing that petrifies me. And it's and people ask, and I think it's dear of them to ask, oh, do you find it cathartic? And I'm like, no. I don't I have yet to have any kind of catharsis demonstrated to me the way that I have yet to experience an endorphin. Like, it is, I think they are, fantasies. And however, I am undeniably working stuff through. You know, I have my own shit, as we all do. I am working it through in my writing, in a variety of ways, some of which are highly recognizable the way they are in Red X because I basically announce them, and some of which in my other books are less identifiable. But if you were to read all three and you were to look sort of, the right way, in the right light or the right angle, you would see the commonalities between the books. So for me, I mean, all of my writing, well, I can't say all. some of my short stories I think are probably a little more like exercises than they are, or sort of like dabbling in things, trying a few things out. Whereas the books are, because of the amount of time it takes for me to write anything, the books are serious business, and they are things where I'm really immersing myself. Um, but as far, I mean, they're a place where I confront my fears for sure. They're a place where I question my fears, where I question them as well as myself and my response to them. Some of my fears I fully, identify as being silly. Some of my fears I think are not uncommon. Um, One of the things that I think is quite present in Red X, well, there are a few things that I think are queer fears that are present at Red X. One sort of, one is um, sort of pervasive, violent homophobia,
Mm.
which is not unusual for queer and trans people to experience. And, that thing of, oh, is today the day that I'm going to be beaten up as I walk down the street? Is today the day that somebody is going to start shouting things at me and chase me, when on a darkened street? Is today the day that, I am entrapped by somebody who uses Grinder and they assault me when I show up in their apartment? Like those things, I mean, I don't want to make them sound like they're common, because I don't think they're as common as we fear they are, but the fears are very real. Um, and so those fears are extremely present in Red X. There are other fears as well. I mean, the fears that are sort of situated around HIV are present as we move through the 80s and 90s in the book. But I mean, in confronting those, it's also confronting the fact um, that HIV was, I mean, at a certain point, it felt like it was an automatic death sentence. But we do know people from the 80s who managed to make it through and get to a place where the medications actually worked and they were actually able to get into remission. This was sadly very, very, very infrequent, but it's not like it never happened. And also, and this is where we sort of got into understanding that you could live with HIV, that you could live with HIV and not transmit to other people. So we sort of came out of the other end of certain, founded and unfounded fears, and we were able to fight them with reality, and that I think that process I think is a very important process. And and also there's the fear, and I think now well founded, that the conservatism that we experienced in the past and the institutionalized sort of socialized homophobia we experienced in the past would go through a period of progress, and then the pendulum would swing back. And of course, now we're getting a lot of that, and we're having to reorganize our minds and our communities around how to combat that. But I mean, the fear. I mean, we all have a fear that one day something will happen to us, and we will vanish with unfinished business. Um, I mean, this is by no means uniquely queer. It's also by no means uniquely North American. We see this happen in various places around the world for various reasons, some of them political, some of them to do with, other kinds of institutionalized violence. Um, Someone who was in your life this morning is suddenly not in your life this afternoon. And um, and that there's an aspect of that truly terrifies me, because I feel like I have a lot of business to finish, and I am getting older, and the older I get, the more likely it is that exactly this kind of thing will happen. That one day I will not wake up. One day I will not come home. One day I will be found in some sort of state. And if it's not the end, it will be the beginning of the end. And I think that's a fear that is very close to being universal. And even, if you're not queer, you will find that fear in this story, and it will be easy to identify with.
So this is a podcast about formative fears, and I invite my guests to talk about those, to interpret that however they like. Um, so when I asked you what formative horror stories you would like to discuss, you brought up something that sort of feels like it was always going to be on the show eventually, because it was formative for so many people. When I told my mother-in-law actually that I was the next episode of the show was going to be about this, she went, "Oh my gosh, I hate horror movies, but I would run home every day to watch this show." And we are talking about Dark Shadows, the legendary gothic supernatural soap opera from the late 60s and early 1970s, created by Dan Curtis, developed by Art Wallace. Best known for Jonathan Frid portraying Barnabas Collins, who very famously was not an original character in the show, only arrived when the show was struggling and they needed some kind of jolt to get more people to watch. David, what do you remember about the first time you saw Dark Shadows?
So, I mean, first of all, let me say I feel for your mother-in-law. She and I are clearly, first of all, we're probably of a similar age, but more importantly, we are clearly kindred spirits. Because, of course, as terrified as I am as an adult, I was even more so as a child. And so, and so this, it's formative because it is complex and paradoxical. So Dark Shadows probably it started, as I recall, in like something like 1965, 66, 67, somewhere in there. And and so I was very young. I was too young to watch it. And but it was that first year, it was introduced as a daily soap opera. It was about a half an hour long each episode. Um, it was it was inexpensive, I think is a kind way of putting it. And it was very much trading on the fascination and the popularity with Gothic romances, paperback novels that you could get at the drugstore. All of them, I think we've all seen them, but in case you haven't, there's usually a moon, there are usually some clouds, there's usually a big dark house on the hill, there's usually a winding road or staircase coming down from it, and there's some poor woman in a negligee who is running from the house, looking behind her. And so I mean, I saw those and I thought they were fascinating. And I couldn't even imagine what story was being told in them when I was a small child, but they were there. And so for that first year, that was really the vibe that they were going for. Unfortunately, the it didn't really translate into television the way that they had hoped for. So, as you say, they were struggling towards the end of the first year, and Dan Curtis and I guess Art Wallace as well had this sort of like Hail Mary kind of, moment where they thought, we're going to put in a vampire. We're just going to go nuts, because something like that had never really been done in a soap opera. Um, there had certainly been, TV movies and certainly a lot of like, B movies that had aired on television that had supernatural themes that came from horror and things like that. But it was really unusual in the sort of world of domestic dramas, like, As the World Turns and The Guiding Light and General Hospital and things like that, to like suddenly stick a vampire in the middle of a show. But they did. And it was a jolt in another way because the way that he was introduced, which I did not see for many years, um, was that um, a secondary character on the show, and in fact a fairly irritating one, broke into a mausoleum thinking he was going to find some treasure and pries open a coffin, and as he looks inside, a hand shoots up from inside the coffin and grabs him by the throat. And that was the end of the episode. And I mean, we were not accustomed to having jump scares on television at all.
Yeah.
And certainly in like made for television material and certainly in the middle of the afternoon. So I think is fair to say it scared the liver out of a whole bunch of people who immediately began talking about the show. And in particular, it began to get a real interest from younger people, younger than who normally watch soap operas. So you did have the phenomenon that your mother-in-law describes, where people ran home from school. Well, whether it be high school or younger, they ran home from school in hopes to catch, at least a few moments of it. Um, for people my age, it was very poorly timed because it was generally over by the time school ended. If you were able to contrive to get out of school early, you could run home and you could maybe catch, 15 minutes or so. But in that first year, the whole show just took off. And media noticed, the world of pop culture noticed, and it became a huge sensation. Jonathan Frid, who himself was, I wouldn't say he was closeted, but I would say that he was circumspect about his queerness. It certainly was not discussed in the mainstream. He was both a brooding and menacing, but also somehow charismatic figure, and he became overnight, inexplicably, a sex symbol. And and was like on Tiger Beat magazine, and was in on all these talk shows, and he smartly leaned into it, and and helped make the show even more of a sensation than it already was. He was kind of like a mid-afternoon sort of Vincent Price, and he had a certain amount of fun with it, but he also understood that the show itself, even though it had a really heavy sort of like brushstroke of camp across it, the show in fact was very serious. And it could only work if everybody in it was taking it very seriously. So when I started watching it, I mean, it wasn't until quite a bit later, but when I successfully saw something that scared me, it was it was when I was probably about 8 years old. And so it was getting closer to the end of the run. It probably only had a couple of years left. And there was a plot that was hugely popular that was set in the 1800s, 100 years prior to the so-called present of when the show was being broadcast. And several of the characters had been catapulted back into the past in order to prevent tragic events that were happening in the present and were going to happen in the future. And so they fully remembered, what life was like in the so-called present, but they had to play act at being these sort of like characters from the past and interact with characters from the past. And one of the characters that was in this sort of like 1800s mix was a cousin or a brother who had been in the Far East and had been doing some sort of archaeological work. And he came back with an artifact that was in this box that was under this sort of like, cloth, with this sort of velvety cloth, and by this point, I think it's also worth pointing out, originally the show was in black and white, and by this point the show had transitioned to color. And color was very different from what we experience in the current century. It was blotchy and lurid and weird, and it didn't translate well from one television to another. The resolution was terrible, which gave it a really eerie quality. So there's one particular day I ran home as this character came in with this artifact to show off to members of the household. And I ran into the living room and I turned it on and I sat down. I was probably sitting maybe about a foot from the screen because I was stupid. And my mother was, I think, down. Yeah, I mean, they all tell you you're going to go blind. And, I wouldn't be surprised if there was enough radiation coming from the television that it explains everything. But, I'm sure I poached my brain that way. But my mother was downstairs doing laundry. I was sitting in front of the television. I don't even think she knew I was home. And I was just like riveted by this, like, this thing where he takes the box and he puts it on the table and he pulls the cloak off. And I mean, he says that it is a statue or a carving of a head,
Hmm.
but it looked, I mean, its eyes were closed, but it looked quite lifelike. At the same time, you're looking at it and going, but it's a head on a table. So my thought was like, oh, it's this really sort of like gross dummy head. And of course, the characters are recoiling because it is so disgusting and, oh, it's evil and all of this stuff. And, one of the characters, the Joan Bennett character, in fact, the matriarch of the family, she's so repulsed by it, she has to leave the room. And then when we cut back to the head, quite close, and in this greenish light, its eyes are wide open. And I screamed at the top of my lungs, and I ran for the stairs. I ran up the stairs. I ran into my bedroom. I slammed the door. I ran into my bed. I pulled the covers up. And my mother, of course, was trying to like figure out what's happened. Where am I? What's going on? She comes in. I have all but pissed myself over this one moment, which could not possibly be like duplicated in my life for years. And truly identified how terribly high strung I was as a child, but also how I had never been confronted by anything like this. I knew that there were things that were scary that I was not allowed to watch. I knew there were things that were suspenseful and I found them difficult. And I had certainly seen sort of like Sunday afternoon, sort of like Edgar Allan Poe type, Roger Corman movies and things like that. But I had never seen anything that had just such a, you know, truly in its own way, without there being a jump scare, and a jump scare created like that. And so that lived with me for years. And one of the things that lived with me about it was, as horrible as it was, I also found something about it very exciting and really enticing. And I found my reaction to it equally sort of exciting and enticing. And that was where I thought to myself, I would like to see what else is scary. I would like to see more scary things. And at that point, we were just moments away from entering into Rosemary's Baby territory, where suddenly horror takes on a whole new tone in pop culture. And we start to see the paperback horror novels of the 70s and the 80s. We start to see a whole wave of, I guess, what we would describe as the first wave of elevated horror, in a lot of ways, and a lot of focus on the occult, a lot of focus on the supernatural and stuff like that. So I mean, if we can call this an awakening, it couldn't have come at a better time, because suddenly it was a feast that was available to me.
So I've been thinking about this, and I realized some point a few days ago that I actually saw parts of Dark Shadows when I was a child,
Mhm.
and had not really remembered it. And listeners, longtime listeners will know, like, horror was not a thing in my house as a kid. Was not allowed near it, but I had that itch for it. I had that feeling of, if I saw something uh creepy or eerie, even if it scared me, I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to understand what about it was doing that. And my first experience with Dark Shadows was probably, I think it was the Sci-Fi Channel. I think it
Oh.
was right as we first got cable, before every cable network had their own slew of original programming that was on all the time. They would rerun stuff. So the Sci-Fi Channel was forever rerunning, genre shows from the mid to late 20th century. And so I'm watching this, and I probably was 8 or 9. I'm channel surfing because it was like the first time we had a satellite dish, so I could channel surf more than 4 channels. And I'm going through and I see something called Dark Shadows, and my brain immediately went, Dark Shadows? That sounds cool. I wonder what that is. And I knew just based on the title that this was not something that I would be allowed to watch. I knew when my parents walked in the room, I was going to have to change the channel because they were going to go, What are you doing? You're not supposed to see scary things. And I remember nothing about the story. I do remember it was still the black and white era of Dark Shadows. And I Barnabas was not there, but there were other characters, and I think they were exploring a basement or an attic. It was a very cobwebby space with like overturned chairs and that kind of thing. And they have that eerie music that is all through Dark Shadows. And I was riveted because I was like, what are they going to find up here with all these cobwebs and all this crazy music? And then of course I had to change the channel and I never got to find out. But you were kind enough to sort of curate for me a selection of a few episodes, a few of your favorites. Because there are listeners, if you don't know, there are over 1,000 episodes because this was on 5 days a week for 6 or 7 years. So there's quite a bit of it. And you sent me that head episode that you were just talking about, and I love that episode because it is such a like 20 something adventurer kid thing to do to come in the house and go, Mom, look what I found. And it's this awful looking head. And she immediately is like, That is awful. Cover it up. Get it out of my house. I don't want to be anywhere near it. And he's like, No, but look how cool it is. And I can just imagine being a kid and being like, it is kind of cool. I get her point, but it is kind of cool.
Oh yeah. I mean, one of the things that's really lovely about it, and as you say, they're like for Sci-Fi Channel, it would have been a no-brainer. You have like hundreds and hundreds of episodes. You would have been able to buy them fairly inexpensively or
Yeah.
license them fairly inexpensively, and you would have been able to run this thing forever, right? So it was like, this is a great way to fill time. And and one of the things that was really, even in the very few that I saw until later on, it taught people watching it what the language of horror was. And you've given a good example of that. You know, the spooky basement or the spooky attic with the cobwebs and the overturned furniture. You know you're not watching General Hospital.
Yeah.
You know you're watching something that is trading in a different kind of language, a different kind of imagery, and with characters who have entirely different concerns. And so even though I think a modern viewer will look at it and go, oh, this is really amateurish, and how could anyone take this seriously? And how could somebody be scared by this? There's still enough in it that you think to yourself, oh, yeah, in the right mood, at the right time, in the right era, this would really have worked on people. This would really have gotten under some skins. And and particularly because the characters have, insofar as it was television, and so you had limitations, the characters have really unwholesome, dangerous, disturbing relationships with each other, and particularly around Barnabas's quest, both first of all to get fed, but secondly also to try to understand his own nature and to try to find out if it's possible for him to love again or to recreate his lost loves. Um, those things are really fascinating, and those continue to be themes that we see in modern vampire stories. If you watch Interview with a Vampire, I mean, sure, it is much gorier, it is much sexier, but as far as the the sort of the soap operatic melodramatic qualities, those stories are still alive. Those character concerns are still alive, and I think are crucial to how we experience vampires and other supernatural creatures. So for a lot of, particularly young viewers, this was an introduction to a whole world of stuff. And you could go back in the past as far as Dracula and even before, or you could go to any number of other things that were, showing in movie theaters or available at the library. And and you could have like truly a transformative experience in a relationship with horror as a genre.
If you don't feel like you can watch 1,000+ episodes of Dark Shadows, which I will definitely be going back and watching more. There is a documentary. I think it's streaming on Prime right now. It's called Master of Dark Shadows. It is about Dan Curtis and the whole Dark Shadows phenomenon. Dan Curtis was not a soap opera guy. He was not even a scripted TV guy. He was an ad man who had transitioned into producing like golf shows. And then one day he had this idea for this gothic drama and initially didn't want it to be a daytime soap. He was like, "No, I'm after something more sophisticated than a daytime soap." But they convinced him, and at the time, soaps were much more women sitting around each other's kitchen tables and talking about neighborhood gossip and that sort of thing. It wasn't the sort of evil twin, crazy twist-filled stuff that we think of now. But so they make this show, and he credits his kids with like coming to him because it was flagging in the ratings, it wasn't working, and they were looking for ways. And I think before the vampires showed up, they tried a couple of things. There was a ghost story. One arc was a little ghost story, and then they did this weird thing where one character was a phoenix and she was reborn in the fires of the phoenix or something, and it did better. So they were like, okay, vampires. And it it cannot be like, I knew in the academic sense, like, yes, Dark Shadows, not popular, add vampire, very popular. What I did not know was how big it was.
It was
Um,
big.
it was so big. Like it
It was
is.
so prevalent. It was so present. Like there was a board game. And I mean, and when you say like there was a board game, this was not for children.
Yeah,
So why would you make it's like, oh, it's like making a board game of Alien for children. No. What are you doing? But it was just so present everywhere. And there was an attitude at the time, which of course is long gone, that if you had something that was airing on television, it had gone through standards and practices. There were censors on every network. And so it must be okay for kids, which of course was not true at all. It was possible to air things that would be wildly upsetting for children. They just weren't really thinking about how any of this stuff worked. And so but it was just everywhere. Like it just saturated pop culture. And I would say much to our benefit. I think now many people would watch it and go, like, what was the big deal? And the big deal was it was unique. And it really did pave the way for a lot of other stuff, some of which was insane. However, it did do that. And it also anticipated a lot of stuff, which was incredibly shrewd. Like Dan Curtis, this was the start of his horror career, and he had quite a robust horror career, with television and eventually with film, where he did two Dark Shadows movies. He did classics like The Night Stalker, which is another show that just absolutely terrified me. Night Strangler, which was its follow-up. The Night Stalker series. He did Burnt Offerings, the movie, which was based on a best-selling, paperback novel, and so he really established himself. Also, he did Trilogy of Terror with Karen Black, which was, itself fantastic.
yeah.
And so he once he was on the track, he knew exactly what he was doing. He may not have been entirely fulfilled by horror, but horror was certainly fulfilled by him. And he made a lot of inroads as far as bringing horror that really worked into people's living rooms where you did not expect like horror to be scary. So he was very smart that way. And yeah, just outstanding work.
Well, and once the door opened, once it was like, okay, we have introduced this vampire character, he's immediately the most popular thing on television. Like Jonathan Frid was on TV variety shows in the evenings, both as himself and in character as Barnabas. He would show up and do bits with comedians based on the popularity of Barnabas. He was on the cover of teen magazines. This was like a middle-aged man. He was not a young, hot heartthrob guy, but he became a heartthrob because of his charisma and his presence. And so once that worked, Curtis and Wallace and everyone else is like, okay, well now the money train has rolled into town. We got to keep it going. So there are witch episodes and demon episodes and werewolf episodes and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein, and it just became this buffet of any horror trope we can mine. We're going to throw it on Dark Shadows.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And some of that, I mean, obviously some of that stuff is ridiculous. And but some of it was really effective. There's a whole thing around, I mean, the ghosts in the show are particularly effective and often poignant. There is a sort of a widow's hill sort of area where a number of women from the Collins family have like thrown themselves off or have fallen off for various reasons, and their ghosts are calling out to to the women of the Collins family to come and join us. And it's like that is really unpleasant. And several times I've mentioned Joan Bennett before. Joan Bennett, A-list actress in her time, now, older, still very serious minded, gets to swan around in some amazing outfits, gets to like admit, yes, I murdered my husband. Yes, he's buried in the basement. Then she discovers he's not buried in the basement. In fact, that's been a cover up. He's actually still alive and he's out there somewhere. And she's like, so all kinds of stuff like she gives it her all. She is absolutely dead serious through the entire thing. I don't know how she does it. And and all of the stuff around her ending up at the edge of the cliff and possibly heading over is really genuinely unsettling. And there is a ghost child in the old house, and she's unsettling too. And like all of that stuff is surprisingly effective. And you do at times think to yourself, how did they even get away with this? Was anyone paying attention on this show? But yeah, I mean, they also had werewolves and zombies and a variety, and all the greatest hits. And that I think ultimately led kind of to their downfall because they kind of burnt it all out. But what can you say? I mean, hundreds and hundreds of episodes, you are going to run out of steam sooner or later. In a
Yeah.
lot of ways, they went out the way they should have gone out. They threw everything they could at the screen, and people ate it up. They just
Yeah.
ate it up.
So I'm gonna peel back the curtain slightly and tell people this is actually the second time David and I have had this conversation because we had a catastrophic recording failure last time. And if you're hearing this, that means we didn't this time. So we win because we're determined. But the reason I bring it up is um, last time we were talking about Dark Shadows, you said that you learned a lot of storytelling tricks from watching this show and from watching how they were able to sustain these arcs over time. Because Dan Curtis was on record as saying once he realized that he could go into the past and do stories in the past with the Collins family and just use the same actors. So it's like Joan Bennett is there, but she's not playing the modern matriarch. She's playing the matriarch from 120 years ago, and they look similar because they're related. So he said, once I got into the past and realized I could do all that, I never wanted to leave. Um, I didn't really get to ask you directly last time, so I want to ask you now. What storytelling tricks did Dark Shadows teach you that you feel like you're still applying to things?
Well, I mean, one of the things that was because it was well before I went to see any sort of plays, and had any sense of how theater worked. Um, there were certain aspects, like for example, the doubling aspect that you just described. There were certain aspects that had a theatrical quality and were using a theatrical kind of language. And so, for example, I've had any number of works that go back in the past and into the present and back in the past again, and using that as a storytelling device and in many ways doubling characters, certainly on stage, but also in my books, um, has become a really interesting tool and something that I enjoy exploring. But the other thing that I think you can't discount with soap operas in general is the ability to sustain long narratives and the devices and tools they use to have something not just sort of get stretched out, but also sort of spin out and expand beyond in scope and in imagining beyond the starting point. And that is a thing that I find endlessly fascinating. It's like how do you let a story breathe? How do you open a story up? When do you introduce new characters? When do characters reveal things about themselves? Who do they reveal them to? Can your characters keep secrets? Which characters cannot? What are, often when we think of character conflict in a story, and this screwed me up for years because I always kind of misunderstood it. Um, when we think of character conflict, we think of characters who are so at odds with each other that they're crossing swords, and that's not necessarily true. What it really is about is characters who want different things, or they want the same thing but in different ways. And soap operas are in general, and Dark Shadows in particular, was very good at showing characters who were manipulating each other, subverting each other, going around each other, and and wanting the same things or wanting different things or trying to disguise what they wanted from each other, or just simply not sharing what they wanted with the audience. We knew something was up, but we didn't know what it was. And then stretching that out for a really long time. and and particularly in in going back and forth in time, having the concerns of the present be mirrored in the concerns of the past, not just doubling of characters or doubling of actors, but also doubling of themes and concerns, and then throwing that into the future as well. And that was just endlessly fascinating for me. And so and it also was, I mean, if you don't have any money, and the show really did not have any money, even in its heyday, they made the adjustment to color, but it's not like they spent a great deal more on sets or, on costumes. So where they could really give the feeling of luxury was in the number of characters and in the richness of relationships. And so that was a place where, they could really do wild things. And that was something where I thought to myself, okay, well, if I haven't got the money to make a movie, what I do have is the ability to create a sort of a luxury among the characters in the way that they describe things, in the way that they interact with each other, so that you get an impression of something that's being much larger than it actually is. And that I think, and also I guess I kind of learned how to scare people because I learned what scared me. And I thought, okay, I can just go there. I can just, if there is something where I feel like, I poke it and I recoil, well, maybe I need to figure out what that is. And maybe I need to poke it some more because if it's going to work for me, it might work for somebody else. And that I think was, I mean, there are bad things about that. I mean, it's not the best show to learn about jump scares, but however, um, it was not the worst either. So it was, it as far as like what the cultural anxieties were at the time, those are very much present in the show, and how to mine those and work with them, I think was also a really important thing for me to learn.
So you mentioned cultural anxieties. We also touched very briefly earlier, or you touched very briefly earlier on Jonathan Fritz's queerness,
Hmm.
which was not. I don't know if open secret is the right word, but obviously he was not out when he was making all those talk show appearances, and
No.
he has become a queer horror icon over the decades. And I want to just very quickly read a paragraph from Red X here, and I kind of want to make it into something reflective about uh, Jonathan Fridd and your exposure to queer horror creators and how that translates into your own experience as a queer horror creator, because um this is from one of the essays later in the books, and it really just jumped out at me um as as just something very powerful. So I'm just going to read very quickly. But what are queer people afraid of apart from the obvious? I asked myself this as I was writing my first novel, The Bone Mother, which included an array of queer and trans people among its many monstrous and human characters. We are afraid of death, of course, of violence and torture and sickness and suffering, of being exposed and humiliated and shunned and persecuted. We are afraid of being erased or unseen or forgotten. We are afraid of being alone. Sometimes being queer is about all those things. They are at the heart of our history and the root of our oppression. Sometimes being queer is about being cast out. Sometimes it's about casting ourselves out, walking or running away while we still can. Sometimes being queer is about being the monster, the one who corrupts, the one who devours. Sometimes, after everything and everyone has been stripped from us, sometimes being queer is about being the last one standing. So, taking that uh, into account, which is beautiful. Some of my favorite writing of yours, and understanding that as a child you were watching this gay man be a vampire, which of course is a timeless metaphor for the outcast, and then writing a book like Red X. How did Dark Shadows shape you as a not just as a horror creator, but as a queer horror creator? Do you think?
So it's 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 lovely of you to raise this, and thank you for reading that passage because I think it's extremely pertinent, and I also am very proud of it. Um, the 50s, I mean, when it comes to film, really earlier, but in the 50s for television, 50s, 60s, 70s, there were a lot of queer people who were working in television. They were not just working in sort of the stereotypic roles of hair and makeup and sets and costumes. There were writers, there were directors, there were actors, and we know this, and of course we understand this. It's a logical thing. Um, Queer people who had worked in theater were drawn to television because it was steady work. Queer people who were in film, same thing. And um, and yet television was even more restrictive as film was becoming more liberal. Television was much more restrictive about what it could and could not show because it was free and it was in your home and children could be in the room and all of that. You could very vaguely touch on queer topics, but you couldn't really truly address them. So throughout that period, as I was taught, as I mentioned, I learned the language of horror from Dark Shadows, but I also learned the language of queerness from Dark Shadows and from a number of other television shows from that time, where even as a child, I could, there were characters who I felt connected to, and there were situations, storylines that I felt connected to because they were talking about people who were outcasts and outsiders, people who were shunned, people who had what were being portrayed as deviant relationships, people who were sissies, people who were stereotypic sort of sissies who were there to provide a kind of comic relief. People, when it did come to portraying, queer characters a little more seriously, people who were victims. Very often in TV movies that had a queer character and it was a suspense thriller or something, those were characters who were killed off very early on, or they were suspects. They were the killer, they were the monster, or they were the red herring at the very least. There's I watched I think it was a Giallo the other day where there was, a killing of a woman in a park, and the police officer says, "All right, bring in the perverts." And of course, on top of, people who logically could be rapist killers, they also brought in, you know, cross-dressing, prostitutes and guys who were like lurked in parks and things like and washrooms. And it was like, really, but
Mm,
at the time this was the thing. And what I was being taught as a young person as I was seeing scenes like that, you know in TV series, in TV movies, in shows like, you know Dark Shadows, was number one, there was a kind of a community of people like me. Number two, they were not well looked upon by media at all, and possibly by anybody else. And number three, if I was in fact like them, even though it would mean that I would have mistreatment all my life, I would need to find them. And where would I find them? And in a lot of ways, without necessarily intending to, these were shows and stories that were telling me this is where you find them. This is how you're going to find them. You're not going to find them in a small town. You're going to find them in a big city. You're not going to find them in the suburbs. You're going to find them downtown. You're going to find them in certain neighborhoods. You're going to find them being talked about in certain ways. This language of queerness was starting to become very present. And I, as much as I absorbed the language of horror, I also absorbed the language of queerness. And I absorbed it from books as well. Old books, new books, and that became also very important to me. But at the heart of all of that was a group of people, mostly in Hollywood, who were afraid of being found out, who had to keep a tight lid on everything, who had to have fake relationships, who had to go and suffer being jokes on TV comedies, who had to fear that they were going to be in tabloids and in gossip columns. Like, and Jonathan Frid was one of those people. You know, he had to play a relatively fine line, being in many ways a very heterosexual vampire, but having an allure about him that I would credit to his queerness. And that even if, your average sort of like 60s housewife didn't detect it, somebody did. Somebody could. One of those people was me. And and it was true of other, Paul Lynde was a great example. Paul Lynde
Yeah.
was, a tremendous sort of arch, caustic, sissy-ish kind of character on Laugh-In and a variety of TV shows and a variety of movies. Bewitched was filled with queer people, and I watched that throughout my entire childhood. At the same time, he was the father. Inexplicably, he was the father in Bye Bye Birdie. Like it just like made, and in some beach party movies, it made no sense whatsoever. However, by doing that with him, they could make a whole bunch of jokes about him. At the same time, I'm sitting there and going, well, if I'm like anybody, I'm like him. I'm like him. Who is he? What is going on with him? Where is he? What is his career about? What is his life about? And, and eventually, you realize because you read what other people say, oh, Rock Hudson is being talked about. Oh, Montgomery Clift is being talked about. Oh, James Dean is being talked about. And suddenly there's a world of queerness. And what does it mean? And how does it work? And where do I fit in? And how do I find it? And those things became huge concerns as I grew older, even as I was afraid of those.
So when we say horror has always been queer, that is a big
Oh,
part of what we're talking about, everybody. Um,
from Gilgamesh. From Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the first, well, first of all, it's the oldest surviving written story, but it's also the first queer story and it's the first horror story. A man falls in love with a werewolf.
mhm.
And that endures, and many other old stories endure, Dracula's queer, Frankenstein has a queer aspect to it. Their creators have queer aspects to them. A lot of that stuff is carried down through Gothic. A lot of that stuff was carried down through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s to today. And so as horror has always been with us, queerness has always been with horror. Absolutely.
Our guest has been David Demchuk, everyone. David, before we let you go, will you let everybody know where they can find you online?
Well, if you must, you can find me. You can find me on Instagram at david.a.demchuk. And you can find me on Blue Sky at daviddemchuk.com, which is not coincidentally also my website, daviddemchuk.com.
Which is a beautiful website, by the way. Love the design of David's website. And everyone, if you have not read Red X, this new edition that Hell's 100 just put out is beautiful. You will not regret picking it up and reading it. It is an essential piece of 2020's horror. I know we still have a few years left in the 2020s, but it's going to stay an essential piece of 2020's horror. David, thank you so much for being on the show. It was so great talking to you.
Oh, it was wonderful talking to you too, again. And and thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure.
Thanks once again to David Demchuk for being on the show. As we mentioned during the recording, we had this conversation once and had a catastrophic technical failure on my end. And David was kind enough to come back and have the conversation all over again. And it was a delight to speak with him both times. I can't thank him enough for bearing with me through all of that. And I appreciate all the listeners who also dealt with us not having an episode last week because of the aforementioned technical catastrophe. Red X is available now in a beautiful new edition from Hell's 100. I highly recommend picking it up. It's a fantastic book. And head to daviddemchuk.com for all your David Demchuk needs. If you want to keep track of everything we have going on here at The Scares That Shaped Us, the easiest way to do that is to find us on Blue Sky. We are at scareshapedus.bsky.social over there. You'll get every update we have. We are also The Scares That Shaped Us on Facebook, and we're The Scares That Shaped Us on YouTube. If you prefer to listen to your podcast that way, head over there, like, and subscribe. We appreciate you. If you like the show, please do us a favor. Tell your friends about us. Let everybody know about this cool thing we're doing. If you are so inclined, you can also head to the podcasting platform of your choice and leave us a 5-star review. That is extremely helpful in getting us featured on the various podcasting platforms and helps us to grow our audience. And speaking of growing an audience, I want to take a minute and talk to you about Pop Heist, which is a pop culture website where I am one of the senior writers. One of the driving forces behind everything that's going on over there. Some of the work I am most proud of in my entire career in any genre, any format I have done at popheist.com. We are entirely worker owned and reader supported. There are no ads. There are no algorithms. There is no private equity backing us up. We write about what we care about when we care about it. We write with passion and expertise and a lot of fun. And we are entirely reader funded. So if that sounds like something you would be interested in, you can head over to popheist.com. That's heist as in HEIST .com /products. That is where you will find the subscription information. We are having a sale right now where you can get half off your subscription for the first 3 months at any level. Our introductory price is $7 a month. That means that right now, if you go subscribe to Pop Heist, you get 3 months for $3.50 a month. That is just a little over $10 for 3 months of content. What kind of content? All kinds of content. Our founder and editor-in-chief, Brett White, just ran some amazing stuff about the history of Cobra La and the G.I. Joe movie. There's a lot of cool new stuff about the X-Men 97 series over there. My pal Sean T. Collins, one of the great pop culture writers of our time, one of the great cultural critics of our time, is writing about Twin Peaks. I am over there recapping the entire original run of the Hannibal TV show. We're in season 3 right now. That is so rewarding and so cool, and I love doing it. We're about to wrap it up, and I'm going to pick another show to write retro recaps of. I just reviewed The Odyssey. That is over there right now on popheist.com. If you want to check it out, The Odyssey rules, by the way, especially if you like horror. We have a ton of cool content. Some of it is exclusive to subscribers. A lot of it is completely free. If it sounds like something you're interested in, please head over to popheist.com. Check it out. If you like what you see, throw us a subscription. It helps us immensely to keep the site growing, to keep paying writers, because we do believe in paying writers as much as we can. But we need reader support to do that. So that's my pitch for Pop Heist right now. I hope you head over there, and I hope you like what you see. That is it for me this week, everybody. We will be back next week with another brand new episode. Look for an announcement on who that guest will be on Blue Sky in the coming days. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. I'm Matthew Jackson, and this is The Scares That Shape Us.